So again, my name is Curtis Young. I'm with Ohio State University Extension. I've been with Extension for 28 years. I'm an entomologist by training, and I have a pretty good interest in this particular topic. And the first thing to look at is the importance of pollinators. Pollinators, when it comes to our ag industries, not necessarily our field crop industries, but certainly a number of aspects of our ag industries, is a very valuable activity that insects carry out for us. Worldwide, it's at least $29 billion of value to that. Roughly 80% of all flowering plants need a pollinator to be successful at setting that reproduction in motion and assuring that it produces a crop. Worldwide, for honeybees, 30% losses of hives each year in the past decade or so has become a major issue. And beekeepers say that a 15% loss of hives is acceptable. So we're at twice that rate at the current time, which could be a major threat to our industry if we continue to lose honeybees at that rate. We also went through the episode of colony collapse disorder that came, it for the most part went, but it still has had an impact on the available honeybee colonies that we've had out there. One of the things that occurred because of colony collapse disease is those apiarists that were on the verge of saying, well, I'm going to continue or not, that pushed them out of the business, and so we've lost a number of apiarists out there to maintain those colonies. Honey is certainly one of the aspects of honeybee colonies, and that is about a $5 billion industry worldwide. That's a lot of money. But it's the pollination that has the greatest value. Get back there. Why is it disappearing? Oh, well. Anywhere from $30 to $200 billion industry worldwide. That's a lot of money that could be lost if we don't have that pollination. Consequences of poor pollination. In vegetable crops and fruit crops, you may see the fruits starting to develop, but because they haven't been pollinated, they will rot on the vine and will not complete that development. So that's a major issue. And again, the amount of value just in Ohio in 2009 was $216 million worth of produce as a result of pollination. Now we talk a lot about honeybees, 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 because that is one of the few domesticated insects that we have in the world. But the question becomes, are there other insects out there other than honeybees that can account for pollination? Is there anything else out there? Yes, there is. And in fact, besides the honeybees, the European honeybee is the one that we're talking mostly about. There are definitely other orders, and I've got myself ahead of the schedule here. But you can see, besides honeybees, there are bumblebees, digger bees, orchard bees, metallic bees, sometimes called sweat bees, leaf-cutter bees, and carpenter bees, just to name those in the Hymenopterans. And that's what you see on the cards that were handed out to you, were some of those different species out there. Now the problem with everything other than the honeybee is that they may have very short windows in which they're active. For example, the orchard bees are only active in the very early portion of the season. They're only active during the springtime, which for apple trees, peach trees, almond trees, etc., that is an important time of the year for those trees. But for other crops, like vegetable crops that will bloom all summer long, the orchard bees are pretty much useless because they're not around during that time. Metallic sweat bees, they tend to come later in the season, so they're good for late season types of pollination. Leaf cutter bees can be present through most of the summer, but there's not tons of them. And most of these other bees are not domesticated, so we can't carry them around at our convenience to put them in places that they are needed. So when we look at some of the common characteristics of these bees, true bees have a narrow wasp waist for identifying. They have relatively long antennae. Many of them have their female ovipositor modified into a stinger, and that stinger is for defense. But it's also where they lay the eggs through. So they have that stinging. Some of the rarer qualities of the bees, there are very few that are social, meaning that they live as a colony. Bumblebees live as colonies, and honeybees live as colonies. Most of the rest of these bees are solitary bees. Now, they may end up in a very common place because of environmental conditions being conducive for them, but they work individually, and so their efforts are solitary efforts rather than colony efforts. And then for that byproduct, the honey production, only the European honeybee produces honey as a byproduct, as a social colony. All the rest of these bees, they collect nectar, they collect pollen, but they make that into a ball to feed directly to their offspring. And so they don't have that secondary product that goes with it. Some of the characteristics of the bee to identify them are basic insect layout, head, thorax, abdomen. They have 2 pairs of wings, so 4 wings total, and 3 pairs of legs, foreleg, hind leg, and middle leg. Now, one of the other characteristics that you see on this is that the true bees have their bodies covered with lots and lots and lots of hairs. And not only are they covered with hairs, but they have lots of branches on those hairs. And that's what makes them so good at pollination, because all of those hairs on their body pick up the pollen from whatever flower that they are visiting and carry it with them to the next flower. They have specialized patches of hairs, like this leafcutter bee on the underside of its abdomen. It has this dense accumulation of hairs where it packs the pollen onto its body. If we look at a bumblebee or a honeybee, it's patches on their hind legs where they pack all that pollen onto their body. So that hairiness of their body is what accounts for a lot of their pollination ability, because they have these specialized areas where they can accumulate the hairs. So in most of our native bees, besides the European honeybee, we have those that nest in the ground, and they really are attracted to sandy, loose soils. If you're living in a heavy clay area, you may not have many of those digger bees. We have cavity nesting bees, and you can see nesting boxes that have been man-made with lots of holes drilled into them with about a 3/8 inch drill to make it appropriate size for them. Orchard bees fall into that category. And then the bumblebee is another colony type of bee. And if you've been in any of the greenhouses that produce tomatoes through the winter, they have boxes of bumblebees as colonies that they distribute through the entire greenhouse so that they will pollinate the tomatoes through the entire winter season. They're docile for the most part. You can stand right beside the boxes at the ends of the long lengths of plants, and they won't care. As long as you don't kick the box or disturb the box, they will just go about their business of pollinating those tomato plants. So they can be very useful. Now to my question, are there other pollinators other than the bees to accomplish what we need them to do? And the answer is absolutely. There are a multitude of beetles that visit flowers on a regular basis. Unlike the honeybees or the other bees in the Hymenoptera, these beetles are still very hairy-bodied. They're simply there to consume nectar and the pollen. Then by chance, because of the hairiness of their bodies, they can carry pollen from plant to plant. Flies, a multitude of fly species, are very important in pollination. And so here you see one of the tachinid flies, again a very hairy type of fly that can pick up a ton of pollen on its body, and when it visits other flowers it can carry that pollen forward. And then of course the moths and butterflies, they are also very commonly associated with flowers and potentially carrying that pollen. Of those other groups there, the Coleoptera, the Diptera, the Lepidoptera, which one of those do you think is the most important in pollination? Any idea? What's that? Yes, the true flies. which most people never even think that flies can be incredibly important to pollination. Everybody thinks bees, and most of the time it's just honeybees that we think about. But flies are tremendous pollinators, and sometimes the most dominant pollinators that we run into in natural systems. So they can be just as important to protect. All right, so attracting these pollinators, how do we, if they are so important, how do we get them to come into a particular area in great enough numbers to be able to do anything of service to us? Well, obviously, one of the things that we need is something for them to visit. There has to be a flowering plant available that has pollen and nectar available to them to make it worth their while to come into an area. Now, if we're talking field crops of soybean and corn and wheat, winter wheat, or barley or rye, the grasses are really not that good at providing food resources to our pollinators. So our corn crop and our grass crops, they really don't do much for us to attract different pollinators into an area. Soybeans, they're marginal as far as being attractive to pollinators. And why I say that is soybean are self-pollinated flowers. They're pretty much closed flowers where that pollination occurs in the individual plants. Now, bees will visit soybean. And that's an important thing to remember. Bees and other insects will visit the flowers of soybeans. So when it comes to protecting these pollinators, we have to remember that if those soybeans are in bloom and you think you need to use an insecticide treatment in those soybeans, you could be threatening the pollinators that are present in that field. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, you don't just say, well, I'm going to close my eyes and put my insecticide on anyhow. You think about timing of activity of those pollinators. When are they most active through the day? And it turns out that they're active mostly in the middle of the day. So late in the evening or really early in the morning are the best times to avoid hitting those pollinators if you need to apply an insecticide. And there's other things that you have to pay attention to as far as what kind of formulation, how long is that insecticide potentially available to the insects to come into contact with. Now notice the distances that some of these pollinators will travel. Honeybees will go up to 4 miles away from their hive to find resources to consume. That's another thing that you have to keep in mind. Where is the nearest apiary to your field that you might need to spray with an insecticide? Up to 4 miles away. And so this is a fantastic time of the year just to drive around your area and spot where hives are located. Because during the summer, they can be highly hidden behind hedgerows, behind tall weeds. But right now, they can be incredibly visible so that you can start logging where those hives may be. Now, bumblebees, they don't use a hive like the honeybees, but they can travel up to 6 miles away from where their colony is located to find crops or find flowering plants to utilize. Smaller bees have a much smaller range, but again, since they have that ability to fly, they can travel great distances as long as there's a resource for them to come to. And we're coming to that here in a second of what those resources may be. When we look at cover crops or crops in general, the grasses are of little use and of little attractiveness to the vast majority of our pollinators. So if we're looking at a cover crop of cereal rye, or if we're planting barley or wheat or corn or sorghum, there's not much of attractiveness to pollinators in those crops. When we go to the legumes, alfalfa, bird's foot trefoil, all of the clovers, or most of the clovers, vetch, cowpea, they are incredibly attractive to pollinators. And they are important resources to all the different types of pollinators to keep them in an area, keep them well-fed and active and alive. And then, of course, when we get down to other broadleaf plants, other than the legumes, Buckwheat is amazing. Buckwheat can be an absolutely fantastic resource for pollinators. Some of the brassicas, the radishes, if they ever get to blooming stages, can also be very supportive. Canola, sunflowers, again, much better resources for the insects. And when we're talking cover crops and conservation tillage and incorporating those crops into the overall cropping practices, we could be providing a resource for those insects. Unfortunately, there are some problems with that, and we'll come back to that very briefly here. So here's buckwheat, very attractive to a multitude of different types of pollinators. We have bumblebee here, we have a true fly up there, we have a butterfly, a monarch over there. If you've ever walked into a buckwheat field that is in full bloom, it is just alive with insects. Now the challenge with buckwheat is it germinates and reaches maturity very rapidly. And if you're planting a field to buckwheat, they're all blooming simultaneously. And then, depending on your purpose for that buckwheat, you may be out there to terminate that crop before it actually goes to seed, because then the buckwheat becomes a weed in that field if you allow it to go to seed. So depending on how you manage that buckwheat will determine its viability for pollinator support. Now, the other thing that we need to be able to do is determine what kind of insect pollinator that we have out there. So you have two insects here. Are they both bees? Are they both bees? Is one a bee and one a fly? Yes, they are. One is a bee and one is a fly. Can you tell which is which by looking at the slide? The bee is on the left. The fly is on the right. Now, one of the distinctive characteristics of a fly is flies have one pair of wings. Bees always have two pairs of wings, which means you have to get pretty close to examine them to see that, but this is a fly. The other thing is the antennae of the flies tend to be very short, and the antennae of bees tend to be long, and the bees tend to be hairier, but not that great of a distinction between flies and bees there. All right, clovers. Clovers of all sorts produce tremendous nutrient resources, nectar and pollen for pollinators. And again, we have a fly, a bumblebee, a butterfly, and a honeybee demonstrating their like for the white clovers. And we can use clovers for an underseeding to a number of our small grass crops, such that once that grass crop is harvested, that ground cover or that cover crop is already there and has a long time to produce pollen and nectar for the different pollinators. Crimson clover and red clovers, they too are tremendously attractive to pollinators. Here's a crimson clover, and I've seen a lot of crimson clover incorporated into mixtures of cover crops that are very valuable to these pollinators. And then sunflowers. And sunflowers, not the big tall ones I'm talking about, we're talking about the short ones that can grow very rapidly and reach blooming in a relatively short time. Incredibly attractive to pollinators, the bumblebees. We have an orchard bee or a leafcutter bee there, and then beetles around it as well as important pollinators. So the problems with cover crops as supporting pollinators is many of them don't grow fast enough to the point that they reach bloom in time to do anything to pollinators. Part of it is our cropping systems. When you're dealing with soybean and corn, how much of the season is going to be available for a cover crop to reach to a flowering point that's going to be of any service to the pollinators? And the other thing there is if you're planting something after soybean and corn are harvested, we don't have many choices. Basically, we have grasses like cereal rye available to us as a cover crop. The only thing that comes into play here might be buckwheat. Or if we have another bad season like we had this year, there's all kinds of unplanted fields that can be planted much earlier to get to that point. Short periods of bloom time. If you only have one species in that field and it all blooms at the same time and it's all done within a week's time, that's not a whole lot of service to the pollinators either. I've already mentioned grasses are pretty much useless when it comes to the pollinators. So the other place where cover crops may come into play and be of very great value to pollinators is when we're in a long-term crop. And what I mean by a long-term crop, I'm talking about permanent plants like orchards and vineyards along field edges that if you're going to use that field edge as a place to support and attract pollinators, you can't treat it with an herbicide because those herbicides are going to kill off most of your flowering plants. Lanes, berry patches, etc., where those plants are going to be established in those rows for at least a couple of years to a decade or more, depending on what plant you're looking at. So protecting those pollinators, we have to have places for them to have refuge away from pesticides. We have to know what our pollinators' activities are and what plants they're attracted to and avoid any kind of insecticide on there. Make sure we read our labels. All of our insecticide labels have warnings on them, environmental hazards, and that's where you want to look for what kind of impact they may have on the pollinators. And some are much worse than others, and I'm not pointing specifically to imidacloprid, but imidacloprid's been getting a lot of bad press because it is it's a systemic insecticide, and some have indicated it as being carried into the nectar through the plant and then potentially poisoning or sublethally poisoning pollinators that way. Now, protection of bee advisories on our newer labels for insecticides, you look for them on the label, and they will tell you what you have to be aware of when it comes to protecting bees and other pollinators in that field. Planting issues, and this is one place where the neonicotinoids have been getting a lot of attention, is many of our corn and soybean are treated with neonicotinoid types of systemic insecticides that are planted with the seed. Well, that doesn't seem like much of an issue, except for if you really think about when you're emptying that bag of seed into the hopper of the planter. When you get down to the bottom of the bag, what's coming out of the very end of that bag as you're filling that hopper? Usually a pile of dust. And if you're holding that bag up high and the wind catches that dust, it's dispersing that insecticide out off that field into the air. And likewise, as one is planting, even though most of this is probably just soil dust that is being thrown into the air, you could also have that insecticide dust mixed in there as well. So talc has been used as a lubricant for a lot of our seeds for years. We need to replace that talc with graphite wax mixtures that adhere much better to the seed so that it doesn't get dispensed into the air and then drifting out into places where pollinators may be active. And we may not think of that very much. Formulations, and we'll come back to that here in a second. We have a couple minutes left. Remember when I was talking about all of those different bees, they have those hairs all over their bodies that are branched, that are just perfect for picking up small dust particles and pollen particles. Well, depending on what formulation of insecticide that you might be using, those insecticides may act just like those powders and pollens that the bees can pick up on their body. For example, microencapsulated insecticides. They can be tremendously similar to pollen grains, and they can adhere to the bee's body, and then when the bee cleans itself off back at the colony, they can be carrying that insecticide directly into the colony. The least impactful are the granular formulations because they're big, chunky formulations that aren't going to drift on the air and are going to stay in place. Now, time of day I've already mentioned. Be aware of when pollinators are active and try to avoid their greatest activity periods. And drift, obviously, is an important issue. And some of our insecticides are dispensed in a manner that drift can be a tremendous problem. And so here you see an orchard or a nursery situation, and the types of mist blowers that are used there can have a lot of drift issues associated with them. And then think about where things are blooming. Now, we don't always look at the edges of fields for where flowers are actively blooming, such as dandelions. Dandelions in the springtime are major attractants to pollinators. And if those dandelions are growing in the edges of the fields where insecticides or herbicides may be being applied, it could be very easily drifting over into those areas. Now, I just mentioned herbicide, and you might have thought, well, that's a weed killer. Why do we have to worry about that for pollinators? Well, it's not necessarily a weed killer impacting the pollinator directly. It is if that herbicide drifts onto these flowering plants, it could kill the flowering plants so that their pollen and nectar is no longer available to the pollinator to utilize. Here you have a nursery or an orchard situation, and the roadways between those trees could be filled with clovers, like white clover. And if you're treating these trees, you're potentially treating that clover as well. How do you avoid that? Well, the one way is mow the clover just prior to any insecticide application. By mowing the clover off, you've removed the blossom so that it's no longer attractive to the pollinator during the time that the insecticide may be most readily available. Again, drift issues, be careful of drift. That's always a no-no when it comes to application of pesticides. Contaminating water. Bees drink a lot of water. And if their water resource is contaminated with drift, it can be just as damaging to them. Again, Ohio Pesticide Law says no person shall allow drift to occur. That is against the label, and it's against the law. And then IPM, and this is the last one I wanted to get to here quickly, is in the springtime, a lot of our winter annuals are in full bloom right about the time that burn down applications are being applied. And if we're putting an insecticide in with that burn down application, again, we could be seriously damaging pollinator populations in the spring.